Emotions Matter. Brought to you by emaw.com. That's EMAWW.com. Your solution for emotional intelligence. Thank you for joining me, your host, Monique, on the Emotions Matter podcast. It's my pleasure to interview Kevin Pederson today. Pederson is the winningest coach in Lander women's basketball history with an overall 237-123 record in 11 seasons. He has taken the Bearcats to 8 Peach Belt Conference tournaments and 7 NCAA tournaments in the past 9 years. Pederson has won 6 conference championships in 11 years and has taken 2 programs into the NCAA tournament. He led Anderson to its first ever winning season and first 2 NCAA berths, reaching the second round and the Sweet 16. Prior to joining the Bearcat program, Pederson spent 3+ years as Anderson's head coach. Under Pederson's guidance, Anderson won 2 CVAC tournaments and 1 CVAC regular season championship. Anderson led the nation in scoring in 2003-2004 with 85 points per game and scored 100 or more points 4 times. Pederson went 88-31 during his time at Anderson. He is a native of Fairfax, Virginia, and worked 5 seasons for the Clemson men's basketball program under Rick Barnes and Larry Shiott before joining Anderson College in 2001. Pederson earned his bachelor's degree from Clemson University and his master's from the United States Sports Academy. He is married to the former Adair Clary of Gaffney, South Carolina, who graduated from Clemson with undergraduate and master's degrees. They have 2 children, Connor and Clary. And now I'd like to welcome Kevin Pederson. Good morning, Coach.
Good morning.
So glad you could be with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. So listen, I'm just going to jump right on in it because there's some questions here that I think are pretty exciting. I noticed on your introduction that you worked with Rick Barnes and Larry Shiott, 2 pretty prominent coaches in the history of men's basketball. I'm going to ask you, the first question is sort of involved with working with those 2 gentlemen. What did you learn from your mentors at Clemson about motivation and mental toughness?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think that's where Rick Barnes is one of the best in the business. I tell people all the time, I was very fortunate when I was at Clemson to work with that staff. You also had Dennis Felton, Ken McDonald. At one point, we had 4 coaches on there who at one point were a head coach at Texas, University of Wyoming, the University of Georgia, and Western Kentucky. So it was just an incredible staff. But Rick Barnes, I'll tell you, was one of the best motivators I've ever been around in my life. And then you had Larry Shiott, who was the perfect complement because he was as good at taking care of people as anyone I've ever been around. If you were around Larry Shiott, you felt like he really cared and he was really invested in you. And Rick Barnes was a guy who was just going to get every last ounce out of the people around him to maximize their potential.
Now, how did he do that? And is there anything that you've taken, yourself as a coach and have used it in your own career?
Well, I think one of the things I learned from Rick was every day he came in there, he was 100% invested. When he stepped on that floor, he wanted nothing but the best out of his players, and he was going to give the same. There was never a day he showed up to the practice floor where he felt like he was unprepared. I never remember him walking on the floor and thinking, oh, he just doesn't have it today or he's a little bit tired today. He was always passionate about what he was doing. And I think that's so important when you're trying to get the most out of your players that you're working with. Basketball, we say it all the time, it's more of a marathon than a sprint. It's one of the longest seasons of all the Olympic sports. So when you're trying to get a team that comes in, well, especially at the Division II level, which is a little bit different than what we did when I was at Clemson. At the Division II level, we're the strength conditioning coach, we're the academic coach, we're the basketball coach. We're kind of wearing a lot of hats where our players are hearing from us constantly. And so they're showing up in August, and they're hearing our voice, and then we're riding them in the preseason when you can't do much basketball. It's a lot of weight training and running. And then you've got to get them through. So there's really about 5 months where you're really pushing these kids hard. And when I was working with Rick, the one thing you noticed was every day he showed up, if you didn't show up with your best, he was going to get on you. He'd call you out. And we try to do the same thing in our program. If you're good, we're going to praise you. And if you're bad, we're going to push you. And you don't really earn slack. So if you're the best player on the team, that doesn't give you the right to come in and take a couple of days off because you might win a game for us come Saturday. Every day we're expecting you to give maximum effort. And I think that's one of the things our players enjoy about our program is when you play for Lander women's basketball, I've started a walk-on before, and I've had the National Player of the Year come off the bench for us. So just because it's based on what you do in practice the days leading up to the game, and that's something we took from Rick. Every single day you come in there, we're expecting maximum effort.
Wow, that's probably very different than what these students see in professional basketball.
Yes.
Somewhere along the line there, that sense of, community and team broke away, and it became more about the individual and not so much, the game.
It's funny, people will ask me questions about the NBA and the WNBA, and I'll be honest with you, I really don't watch much professional basketball. I love college basketball, but you hit the nail on the head. Professional basketball is so much more about the individual, less about the team. I just don't enjoy it nearly as much as I enjoy college basketball.
Yeah, the spirit of the sport is really more in the academic setting. People play with heart and not with pocket. So now that brings me to that brings me to another question here. You have a very strong winning streak. It's very impressive with the Bearcats. And can you just tell us if you are currently pretty happy with your roster and the results?
I'm actually, we're at a point that I think I've only been in twice in my career, maybe 3 times if I go back to my days when I was coaching at Anderson University. Coming into this year, we had lost one of the best, arguably the best player in the Peach Belt Conference in Briera Crum. She was the MVP of the conference tournament when we won that last year, just a phenomenal player. And we lose her, we lose Ashley Zandia. They were just the backbones of our program, not for just what they did on the floor, but they were just 2 kids who every day in practice did so much for this team that people never realized. And we come in and we signed, I think it was 8 freshmen. We had a lot of freshmen this year. So we knew we were going to be young. We knew we had 3 players coming back that had shown they could really contribute at this level. But the bulk of our team was unknown. We had, I think we'd lost 4 of our top 7 scorers.
Wow.
So it was a lot of unknown coming in this year. And I hate to use the term rebuilding, because I don't necessarily believe in rebuilding, but we felt like coming in it was going to be more challenging this year to have the type of year we've been having. And then we come out, we win the East Division for the 3rd year in a row, make the NCAA tournament, advance to the 2nd round of the NCAA tournament, and really put together a great season. But the funny thing is, all year long, we've been saying before the year started, we really felt like this year was going to build us for the potential of a very big year in 2017, 2018.
That is very impressive. Wow. And that kind of brings me to my next question here, because our earlier discussion was really revolving around men's basketball, and now you're coaching the females. And so is there, yes. What would you say is the main difference, especially in how you motivate them between the women and the men?
Well, it's funny because that's one of the unique aspects about my career, and I consider myself very fortunate to have worked on both the men's and the women's side, because I think a lot of people don't really understand the two. And I was one of those people. I know when I was first, I spent 5 years with the men's team at Clemson, and then another 3 years at Anderson on the men's side. And I can remember when the athletic director at Anderson approached me and said, hey, our women's coach has resigned. They're right in the middle of the season. The team was very bad. They were 2-5, and they were just losing considerably. Their games weren't that close. And I remember coming and saying, I was 25 years old. And he said, okay, Kevin, he said, we'd love for you to take the job. Now I need you to continue to be the head JV boys coach, the varsity boys assistant coach, and you're also going to be head women's coach. So I literally had 3 teams I was working with. I was running 3 practices each day. And at the time, it was funny, I called Larry Scheid and some of those guys from Clemson, and I was getting their opinion. Matt Driscoll is another guy who's now the head coach down in North Florida that I talked to a lot. And then I also leaned on Jim Davis, who was the head women's coach at the time at Clemson. And I'd always been one of those guys who said, hey, I'm never going to coach women. It's a different sport. I just don't think it's something I want to do. And it was funny. I started coaching, and I'll be honest with you, I realized coaching is coaching. And whether it was coaching women or coaching men, I think the smartest thing I ever did in my career was I treated them the same on the floor. There's never been a day I've stepped on the floor and said, okay, I'm coaching girls or I'm coaching guys. Every day, whether I was coaching guys or girls, I stepped on the floor and said, okay, I'm coaching a teenage or a young adult who wants to be a very good basketball player. And that's just how I've always looked at it. Now, with that said, there are certainly some differences between the two of them. Now, in regards to motivating them, I don't think I've taken too many different approaches. Luckily, I think every athlete I've worked with has always been very serious about wanting to be good. And whether it's men or women, I think every individual has a different button you've got to push. And one of the most challenging things whether it's a coach, and it's probably the same as a teacher, I think you have to really get to know your student athletes so you can find out what motivates them. Some kids, yelling at them will work. Other kids, it's kind of a little quiet talk in their ear that gets them going. And the best coaches, in my opinion, find out what buttons to push. And I think with our freshman class, you typically take at least a year to really find out, okay, how do I motivate these kids? What's the best way for me to get the most out of them? Because it's not as simple as, okay, I'm going to coach the way I want to coach. You really have to adapt your style if you want to be successful to understanding what little buttons it pushes with men or women. And last thing I'll say to kind of wrap that question up, because I get asked all the time the difference between coaching men and women. It's funny to me because when I was coaching men, there were very few guys that ever played for me that didn't think they could play professionally, whether it was in Europe or the NBA. I think every guy thought they could be a professional basketball player. And so the egos are a little more challenging when you coach men. And then I go and I'm coaching women, and there's no egos. They're easier to coach from that sense. But then you do deal with a little bit more drama off the floor. I think you have to be very proactive when an issue comes up. If you're coaching women versus if you're coaching a guy and an issue comes up, they're going to deal with it. If you're coaching an issue with women, you literally have to make sure you deal with it right then and there so it doesn't fester.
That's good. That applies to a lot of things.
Yeah.
Really, that actually brings me to another question here that I had. You were talking about finding what triggers people regardless of their gender or anything. Jimmy Johnson has been quoted as saying that he studied a lot of psychology in college, and he used that background to help him be a better coach, because just like you said, he would figure out what each person on his team needed, for motivation, and he'd look for, like you just said, those trigger points to get them going. Do you ever find that emotions play in any of these trigger points? I mean, if there was a motivating emotion, what would you do, or what do you look for, to kind of help them get to that next level and help them stay focused?
It's funny that you referenced psychology. I say all the time that I feel like Lander University should give me an honorary doctorate in psychology, because it's funny. People, you get asked all the time when you're a coach, what do you do when you're not coaching? And people just can't fathom that we don't teach classes. We don't do these other things. And I tell people all the time, literally, on the floor coaching is about 10% of the job we do. And it's the easiest 10% of the job we do. It's the funnest 10% of the job we do. 90% of our job, it's the off the court. And it's a lot of it is the psychology of the sport. And I really believe the most successful coaches are the best at dealing with the psychology of the game. Because if you don't deal with it, every season has its ebb and flow that you've got to weather. And if you don't deal with issues the right way, or some coaches overlook issues and they'll say, well, we'll just get through the season, I don't think you can be successful. I think you've got to learn how to deal with them in the right way. And the right way never seems to be the same. It seems to change from one situation or from one year to the next year. As far as emotions go, you can't see me right now, but I always take my hand with my players and I kind of hold it up to about my eye level. And I say, listen, I need you to stay right here. And then I kind of make the symbolic gesture of a roller coaster. And I say, over the course of a season, you're going to have your valleys and you're going to have your peaks, but I need you to stay locked in about halfway up the mountain. Because if the highs get too high or the lows get too low, you're never going to make it. You've got to learn how to find and understand, okay, there's going to be days I'm going to feel like I can't do anything wrong. And then there's going to be days where I feel like I can't do anything right. And you've got to settle in when those moments are happening somewhere in the middle and understand the lows aren't going to last and the highs also are not going to last. You've got to stay locked in, because if you just ride the ebb and flow of the season, you're never going to make it. The emotions will consume you. And I think at this level, it's really easy. And I get wrapped up in myself. You'll see me in the games getting excited. It's really easy to enjoy the exciting moments, but you also know as soon as right behind there's something else is going to come around the corner you didn't see coming. So for us, the most important thing to being successful is what you said. We've got to control the emotions and know it's going to be a very long season.
So, this might be kind of asking the most obvious. When you say the lows and the highs, what emotions are you connecting with that, with the lows versus the highs?
Well, there's a few. I think one thing people often overlook, they see the athletes on the floor. What they don't understand is, we've got these players usually for 4 years, and over the course of 4 years, they're 18 to 22 years old. And you think back when you were 18 to 22 years old, you're going to make some poor decisions somewhere along the line. You're going to do something, whether you didn't know it was going to get you in trouble, or you're going to learn a lot of things. And it could be a poor decision somebody makes off the floor. It could be they just failed a class. Every year, it seems like we go through one of the members of our team losing someone who's very close to them. It could be somebody finding out, hey, my mom just found out she's got breast cancer. There are so many issues you deal with through the year that can really affect their emotional state. And it's not easy. And you're trying to get them, we say, between the lines. When you step on that floor between those two baselines that stretch 94 feet, you've got to take a group of 14 or 15 young women and you've got to get them on one accord. And you've got to be able to find a way to say, okay, listen, I know you may be struggling in class, or I know you may have some personal issues going on. We've had players who are facing the end of their careers, or maybe they're struggling with their eligibility and they may not pass a class, and they could lose their scholarship for the next season. There's so many emotions we face. And then you've got to pull them all together and you've got to get them on one page, not just for the games, but every day in practice. And it's very challenging.
Wow.
It really is. And that's one of the things I absolutely love about my job is you come out, very few professions. It's funny, Nicole Robertson, my assistant, we went out to a career day at a local school last week, and it was a speed mentoring. And every 3 minutes, someone different was coming to your table. And so and they had 3 minutes to ask you all kinds of questions about your career. One thing I kept getting was, what do you really love about your career? And one thing I told them was, I said, coaching, it could be good, it could be bad. I said, but it's one of the very few occupations where it's so tangible. At the end of every day, at the end of every season, not only you, but everybody around you knows whether you're successful or whether you're not successful. I think most careers, you could be a lawyer or a doctor. And when you go home and when you go out to eat in a restaurant, people around you, you can probably escape your job. People around you don't really know whether you're successful, or you could be good or terrible at your job. And a lot of people aren't going to know. But when you're a coach, they're going to know. It's very public, and everyone's going to know whether you're successful or whether you're not successful. Personally, I like the fact as a college coach, we get to have a lot of control in that. If we want to be successful, well, then we better bring in the right student athletes. We better mentor them the right way. We better really invest in these players because it's one of the very few professions we are 100% responsible for our success or our failures.
Oh, yeah, really good point. Nobody looks at the work that went behind getting those kids, on the court to do what they do, and they're all their personal sacrifices. At the end of the day, it's like nobody really cares, right? It's like they only care what was the score. It just boils down to numbers. Yeah. I'm going to go back a little bit to when you were talking about, again, the highs and the lows. And you said, I try to tell them to stay at this level. What emotionally, what is that level? Because, the lows are obviously, frustration, fear, sadness, things that seem to bring people down. I'd say the highs were, a sense of desire or hope or joy. What is that emotional level you want them to stay at? What do you call that?
Well, for us, we describe that emotional level as confident yet humble. We need our players walking on the floor every day believing that literally they are the best players. We've played in Cameron Indoor up at Duke. We've played Georgia. We've played Dawn Staley in South Carolina. We've played some of the best teams in the country. And we played the number one Division II ranked team in the nation. We've stepped on the floor against some very high-level opponents. And it doesn't matter. I can remember we went to Duke, and I remember sitting in that locker room with our players and telling them, listen, before we walk out there, let's be clear on one thing. We expect to win this game. And we're going to give you a game plan where our margin for error, yes, that's a little bit lower than what we typically have, but this is what we need to do to give ourselves a chance to win this game. And for us, it doesn't matter who we're playing. We could play the best team in the country or the worst team in the country. We've got to have that confident yet humble. So if we're playing a great team, well, we need to be confident we can beat that team. If we're playing a weak team, well, we need to be humble and understand that team's capable of beating us if we come out and we don't really prepare and do things the right way. So you try and take an approach where it's not about who you're playing. It's about how you're playing. It's about how you approach the game. And so for us, it's just getting their mindset where, okay, you come out, don't relax and don't get too low with your emotions and you overlook somebody or you're not really prepared. At the same time, don't get too amped up. I've had so many teams and it's more challenging in today's generation. Before the game, they want to dance and they want to talk and they want to hoop and holler and they want to do all these things that draws attention to themselves. And I'm always telling them the only thing that should draw attention to yourselves is your game. Don't come out with a funny hairstyle. Don't come out and do gestures because you made a nice play. If we make a nice play, we tell our players all the time, instead of you drawing attention to yourself, you point to the player who made you the pass that led to your great play. You give that credit you paid forward to somebody else. And so that just goes with our confident yet humble. It's a fine line to get these kids to believe, hey, we can beat anybody. But at the same time, humble enough to understand if we don't prepare, we can also lose to anybody. Because you don't want a team that's not confident because they're going to lose games. As soon as something goes wrong, they're going to drop. And I can't have these kids dropping when they believe something's about to go wrong. At the same time, I can't have them overconfident and thinking we're just going to steamroll this team because in our minds we think we're better than this team.
Can you recall any of the games that you have coached where that was the defining moment, in terms of you having either lost that game or won that game? Was there a particular instance that stands out in your mind where they were going in that kind of direction and then all of a sudden, it went into, either the loss or the win?
Yeah. I'll give you a couple examples. And first, one is a general example. I say it all the time. The hardest thing, in my opinion, to create in regards to, everyone talks about the culture of your program. I love Dabo. Of course, I'm a Clemson graduate. I love listening to Dabo Swinney talk because he's truly one of the greats in the business when it comes to culture of a program. But the hardest thing when it comes to culture is creating a winning mentality. It's not the training. It's not the actual winning itself. It's creating that mentality that your kids expect to win, and they understand what it means to win at a high level, and they understand the difference. A game at the beginning of the season is not quite the same as a game at the end of the season. And that culture takes so long to create, because I remember when we built our team up a few years back, we were number one in the nation for 5 weeks. We started the year 23-0, just had a phenomenal season. And we had this culture for 5 straight years. We went to the NCAA tournament. And then it was poor planning on my part. We did not stretch out our classes very well. And we got to a point we graduated 8 of our top 9 scorers in 1 year.
Oh my gosh, 8 out of your 9.
8 of our top 9.
Oh my
We
gosh.
lost 90. We lost 95% of our scoring in 1 year. And so we come in that next year, and we're actually picked top 25 of the nation because we've been top 25 for 4 consecutive years. And so here we've lost 95% of our scoring, and people are picking us to be one of the best teams in the nation. And that was when I really learned, because the process started all over again. And I cannot tell you how hard it was, how much I had taken for granted that winning mentality. And it was painful. It took us 3 or 4 years to really get back to where it was. And now we've been to 3 straight NCAA tournaments. I think we finally have recreated that winning mentality. I thought we really saw it this year, but it was such a painful process. You don't do that in 1 year. You don't do that in 2 years. It took us at least 3 years to recreate a winning mentality. That's kind of your general example. To give you a specific example, I feel like at each job, when I was at Anderson and when I was at Lander, I can recall a game where it's like, okay, they just realized what a winning mentality is. And I can remember when we were at Disney World does a tip-off tournament at the beginning of each year where they take 8 of the top teams in the country. You've got to be a really good team to get in this tournament. And we go down there, and we're playing a school, Henderson State, I believe it's in Alabama. They're preseason, I think, number 3 in the nation, and I think we're number 11 in the nation. Well, they had 2 6'5" centers. They were just absolutely huge. And my players were intimidated before the game. I remember the day before the game, we're going in for our shoot-around time, and this team is walking off the floor. And I saw the look on my players' faces as these giants walking past us. And I'm like, oh, geez, we're going to have to do some damage control. Well, apparently I didn't do a good job getting them ready. And we come in, we are down 27 points at halftime. And our players are they packed it in. And I can remember sitting there. Russ Gregg was my assistant at the time. And we just really lit into them at halftime. And I said, listen, I'm telling you, you have to believe if they can beat us by 27, trust me, we're just as capable of beating them by 27. And you have to believe it. They showed us it's possible. Now we're going to go out there. We're going to show them it's possible. And we came out and we just blistered this team in the second half. And we ended up winning the game by 3 points.
Wow.
And I remember from that moment on, once you teach a kid that what they're capable of doing, it was the eye opener. And then keep in mind, this was a preseason. This is the first 3 games of the season. And so that really set the tone. We ended up going on to be the number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament that year. And we clearly rode that wave. It was one of those moments where when it happens, it's a lot bigger than just one W in the column. We knew that win was going to carry forward with that team. And we went on, I think, to win 20-some games in a row after that. And it was just, they believed from that point on, it's like, wow, we're capable of doing this. And it was just that moment where the emotions came forward and they believed, hey, we can do this. And it was worth its weight in gold, just that one moment.
That is a beautiful story. It's like a David and Goliath kind of moment there, There's the giant, and you got one slingshot, and you got one chance, and you took it, and they aimed, and they struck it down. Wow. That is very thrilling. That really is thrilling. Now, I got to ask you, though, you keep saying winning mentality. What is a winning mentality? Yes. What is that?
Well, a winning mentality is when you step on the floor, it doesn't matter who you're playing, you expect to win that game. And, there's a lot of teams out there, and I tell our team all the time, sometimes we'll get accused of, hey, you beat this team too badly. And I'll never forget a quote from Steve Spurrier, and a lot of people don't like Steve Spurrier, but he made a quote a long time ago when he was coaching at Florida that really stuck with me. And he said, listen, my job isn't to prepare the other team. He said, my job is to prepare my team. He said, now, people are going to fuss me because I'm beating someone too badly. He said, why aren't you fussing at the person who just got beat badly? He said, I did my job. I prepared my team. And he also went on to elaborate a little bit more. When you play really well and you play a complete game, you don't, and I tell our players this all the time, especially in today's with Twitter and Facebook, score watching is very popular. And people are lying to you if they tell you they're not watching other teams' scores who they're going to play that season. So if we play a good team, we don't just want to win. We want to make a statement. Because you don't just win that day. You don't just win that game. If you go out, like we played Clayton State this year, who is a perennial power in this league. They won a national championship a few years ago. And I remember we played them. The first game, we beat them by 20 points. And then the second time we played them at the Peach Belt Conference tournament, we beat them by, I think, 27 points. And this is a team that was ranked, I want to say, 2nd or 3rd in the region, this whole Southeast. And we just destroyed this team. And in moments like that, you don't just beat that team. You put fear in those other teams that are coming your way because they see that score and they're like, gee, if they can beat Clayton State like that, what can they do to us? To me, I think that's something you shouldn't overlook because I know how it is as a coach. When you play certain teams and you know, because I've felt that way about Clayton State before, when you play a team and they start getting going, you know it can get ugly really fast. And it's kind of hard to explain, but that really is worth something. If you can put fear into the teams who are going to play against you, it comes back to one of the original points we made, confidence. Confidence is the single most important factor when you're trying to develop an athlete. If they don't believe in themselves, then no one else is going to believe in them either. But if they have a strong belief in themselves, you can motivate them. They're going to make the people around them stronger. And all of that comes from that one aspect of confidence.
That just led me into my next question. Because you mentioned fear. You mentioned fear. And, obviously
Yes.
Fear is an extremely important factor in sports. Let's turn that around. How do you help your players deal with fear? What if they don't have the confidence? How do you get them to deal with the fear or the responsibility of trying to get that winning shot? There's only a few seconds left on the clock. How do you get their mind into that? What if they're not buying into this winning mindset? I mean, how do you have them deal with this idea of fear?
Well, it's funny because I think every player we sign will tell you, hey, I'm ready. I can handle fear. And then I'm going to tell you the opposite. I don't think we've ever signed a player that could handle fear when they arrived on campus, that could handle the pressure of the college level when they arrived on campus. So it's a unique paradox. They're coming in thinking, hey, because keep in mind that pretty much every kid we signed was the very best player on their team, probably the very best player in their league. So they're confident. They're used to nothing but success. And then they come in high school on their worst day, they're still the best player on their team in most situations. And now you come in and you're surrounded by 13 other players who are just like you. And on your worst day, you're now literally the worst player on the team. If you come unprepared, it's going to be obvious. So for us, it's very important. We get about 6 weeks before October 15th is always the first day of practice for Division II. So we've got about 6 weeks leading up to that where we have our preseason time, where they give you only 2 hours of basketball court time, where you can really work with them with the ball, and 6 hours of strength and conditioning. You ask any of our players, and I've had a lot of Division I transfers, and they'll tell you our preseason is the hardest thing they've ever gone through in their life. And we look at it as their coaches. Our job is to throw them everything we can in the book. So when the games come, the games are easy. If they get in a pressure situation in a game, and it's more than they've ever faced in practice, well, then I've let them down. I haven't done my job. We see our job is to put them as hard as we can. We're going to break them down. We tell them when we recruit them. We tell the moms and the dads, you're going to get a phone call, and they're going to say, this man is crazy. He doesn't care about me. He lied to me when he recruited me. They really don't like me. I can't do anything right. I said, because we're going to have to break them down, and we're going to have to expose them, because when you strip a player down, and you're going to find out, it's like, if you pour water on your deck, it's going to find the cracks and it's going to run right through the cracks. It's the same thing with a young adult you're trying to build up. As we break them down, we pour a little water over them, we're going to find where the cracks are. We're going to find, okay, they get short-tempered, or they get depressed, or they snap at their teammates. We're going to find out what we need to find out before those games come along. If we haven't found those cracks with each player, then we're not doing our job. So we work very hard in the preseason. There might be a day where I tell a player, hey, dribble with your left hand, and they're going to dribble with their left hand. And I said, what are you doing? I said, dribble with your right hand. And we'll just keep pushing them that way until they don't know where they are anymore. And once we break them down, we're going to find out, okay, this kid handles it really well. And if that's the case, we're going to move on to the next kid. We'll start trying to see what they're made of. Or we're going to stay on that kid until they deal with their issues. Because a lot of the kids, they've never had a coach when everything's going wrong. We're going to stay on that kid, and we're not going to let off the gas until we've seen how that kid is going to deal with adversity.
It's like the Army in a way.
It's funny. We tell people that all the time. I don't want to say I've ever been in the Army, because maybe the Army is 10 times harder, but that would at least be the mindset. We'd like to think that's what we're trying to do, is a very similar approach to what the Army does.
Now, once you find those cracks, have you ever found cracks? I mean, having a kid have a short temper or being able to dribble with left or right, those are pretty head on. Those are pretty straightforward things that you can address. Have you ever had a crack, though, that was deeply rooted emotionally, where you had to work on some other things to help regain or rebuild them, or help at least? You can't ever heal a crack. There's always a scar, and whatever wounds life throws at you, there's always going to be a scar, and it's always going to be touchy. So can you recall any particular story where you tried all these other things and then that crack was something that was deeply emotional, and how you helped that student through that?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we've actually got a player on our team right now who the first thing she does when she gets on campus is she tears her ACL. So she has to, she's just come to campus. She was a fantastic high school player. She's excited about her college career, and she's here for a week and her season's gone. I mean, imagine that. You're here for 1 week. You tear an ACL, everyone knows that's your whole season. You don't come back from that in 1 year. It takes a whole season to get healthy. And it ended up, it's been the best thing because this kid was very immature when she got here. She struggled academically mightily and struggled a lot on the floor. So she gets through that year, rehabs her knee, and she comes back. So now she's a redshirt freshman. And she gets on the floor and she thinks, hey, I figured it out. I've had a year to sit and watch, and I've really learned. I'm going to apply everything I learned while sitting on the sidelines. And only for her to find out it's nothing like sitting on the sidelines. When you're actually going through it, it's just nothing like what I thought it was going to be, even though I was sitting here in the front row watching everything. And she struggled. And I can remember one day in practice where she snapped and just took it to a different personal level on one of her teammates that we just didn't approve of. And I said something to her. Well, then she kind of came at me with a similar approach. And I remember sitting her down. I said, listen, I said, I love you to death. I said, but don't confuse that with the fact that I won't remove you from this program in a heartbeat if you ever speak to me or anyone on this team like that again. And here she is. She's a freshman, and she's a talented player. And her coach has said, if you ever do anything like that again, I don't care what, you're gone. You're off this team. I'm not going to keep you in this program. I'll still care about you. I'll still support you in every way I can off the floor, but you just won't have the right to be in this program anymore. And at that day, I remember telling our assistant coach, I'm like, I don't know if this kid can make it 3 more years without having another episode like that. And she's had some painful moments over the next couple of years. And she went through some things like I told you. She was drawing attention to herself in the wrong way. She had her hairstyle, she was scoring 4 points a game. And people would come watch her, and all they talk about was her hairstyle because it was unique and it was eye-catching. And I remember sitting her down at the end of the season. I'm like, how about we fix your hair so people are talking about your jump shot, not your hairstyle? And it seemed like every other month there was another issue with her we were having to deal with. And so many cracks kept coming up. And I just wasn't sure this kid was going to get through it. But you could tell deep down this was a really, really good kid who'd been raised really well by a single parent. And there was just a fine line. She could go. There was one side of her that was very dark, and anytime that side emerged, she got in a lot of trouble. And then there was that side where it was a really sweet kid who grew up in a church family that really knew right from wrong. And we went back and forth with her, and now she's going to be a fifth-year senior. She got a 3.5 GPA last semester. She's going to be our team captain. She's one of those really positive success stories where you look at the emotions she had to deal with, and we just weren't sure she would ever grow out of those emotions. And every year she's grown stronger. And now you look at her and you say a crack never heals. I might argue that because I look at this kid and I see a really strong young woman who has grown from just a kid who had so many issues to overcome that we weren't sure she'd ever make it. And now she's successful in just about every aspect of her life. It's really exciting to see.
So she's found her drive and is leaving all of her baggage behind and sort of emerged out of her cocoon, into this new person, and she's not looking back.
Yeah,
right?
I would say she harnessed her drive because she always had drive. It was almost like a fire burning too bright, too out of control. She's always had drive. She's always been aggressive. It was almost you kind of had to put the restraints on it and save a little bit of it for later because sometimes it was just a little bit too much here and there, and it got her in trouble.
Wow. I bet her future is just going to be wonderful and exciting for you, being her coach and her mentor, to see where that's going to go, where that's going to take her. Do you think
that's one of the positive things
Yeah.
about this job is when you can watch these kids grow up.
And do you ever get them coming back and talking to you?
That's one of the, it's funny because Nicole Robertson, our assistant coach, was the first player ever signed to a scholarship. And we joke all the time because I remember where she was when she played for me and watching her grow up. And she's always telling me, she's a coach, she said, you're never going to realize a lot of the impacts you have. People don't realize it till they've been out of your program for a few years. And she tells me a lot of stories about players. And I get a lot of players who come back years after. We don't sit down and have that kind of sappy conversation about how much they've grown and how much they've learned. But to see them from where they were to where they are now, it's probably one of the most rewarding things about this job, to see these young women grow up and become successful. It's something else.
So tell me, do you think, I mean, I know you said when you look at the players, you don't really like to think of them as men and women, but as people ready to play a game. But you understand, too, that there's some differences there, natural differences. Do you think that in terms of loss, who seems to be more resilient about it when it comes to loss? Would you say that you've had more experience with the men or the women, or do you just really not see that difference at the end of the day?
Well, it's funny. I personally, I don't feel like that's as gender-based as it is personal-based with what's going on in their lives. One thing I think the most common thing you see in college, I remember when I was at Clemson and then at Anderson and Lander, one common thing you see is when a player gets into a relationship and they get into a very serious relationship, the losses don't sting because they're going to go home to a guy or to a girl who's going to make them feel better and tell them what they want to hear. And so to me, it's always, I hate to say, you don't want to discourage things. I want them to, their social life is another issue we can talk about later, but because we tell them all the time, your social life is just that. Your personal life is your personal life. I'm going to stay out of your business. I think that's one of the things a lot of people like about playing for a male. I've heard a lot of people tell me the female coaches they've had get more in their personal lives than I do. Personal life, I'm going to respect it. I'm not going to be your Facebook friend or make you tell me what you're doing all the time. Just as long as your personal life is not affecting the job you do as a student or an athlete. If you can get your job done in the classroom, you can get your job on the floor, then your personal life is just that. It's your personal life. But the moment your personal life affects your grades or it affects your performance on the floor, then I'm going to have to get involved in your personal life and figure out what the problem is. But as far as winning and losing, because I've had guys who just will punch a wall. I can remember my first coaching job. I had a guy, he's now a high school coach in South Carolina, and he was the most competitive guy. And as soon as the game was over, he would it all come out. If we lost, he'd blow up on anyone around him, whether it was it could be an inanimate object. It didn't have to be a person. He would just lose his mind. But I've also been around women who are the same way, who they can't stand to lose. So I think that's one of the things people don't understand. In my experience, women want to win every bit as badly as men do. And I think that kind of goes against the grain. I think people don't want to see that. I think there's some old beliefs that women they're not as competitive as men. And in my experience, maybe we've just been lucky with who we've recruited over the years, but these women want to win every bit as badly as the men do.
Have you ever met a player that was sort of, I don't want to say detached, but really didn't express themselves much emotionally on the field? Or do you think that there's always a passion there? Oh, you have met people who just seem disconnected, but do they play well? Do they play as well?
Well, it's different. I don't think that's something. It's not a stereotype where it's all kind of a one size fits all. It's different per person. But I can tell you this much: those people do not do well with my personality and with our program, the way we train. We do not do well with those people. Some players like that, and it just hasn't ended well for. And I'm not going to say it's their fault, or I certainly want to blame them. It's probably more my fault than their fault. I'm one of the more competitive people you're going to meet. And that's, I love competition. My favorite thing about my job is I get to compete all the time. I want a winner. I'd rather lose than tie. I'd rather lose than not know how good I am, because it's like when we recruit someone, we tell them all the time, tell me yes or tell me no. Don't tell me maybe. Either yes or no both give me a direction to head in. Yes, then we proceed, and no, then I move on in a different direction. Maybe put you in a holding pattern. And it's kind of the same with me for winning and losing. If we're winning, we're heading in the right direction. If we're losing, well, then something needs to change. And that's just, I love that about this profession.
Okay, well, listen, we have a question here. Someone has emailed me a question, so let me pull that up here. Let's see. Okay. This is one of our lawyer listeners, and his name is Nick from Denver, and Nick is 21, and he wants to pursue a career as a basketball coach, but he's afraid of failing and ending up before it even started. What would you say to encourage him to continue to pursue a career as a basketball coach?
Well, my personal experience has always been, my first job when I left Clemson, the coach who set me up at Anderson, and what I didn't know until I got there was it was a volunteer job. I didn't make $1 my first year, and it was almost like a reality TV show. I thought I was being hired as a volunteer to do a lot of things. What I didn't know is they hired 4 volunteers just like me. And it was almost like a rat race. Let's see who can do the best job to have a chance to get a paid position at the end of the year. And, it's funny. I just got married. We're living off my wife's salary. I'm not making any money, but yet I'm working. I mean, in preseason, we were getting to the gym at 5 a.m. and we were coming home at about 8 p.m. And I can remember someone gave me some great advice. They said, Kevin, you need to always approach your job like you're making $100,000 a year. It can never be about the money. If it's about the money, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And it's kind of the same with me with failure. I've never worried about failing. It's always just been, we're not going to fail. We're going to do the best we can. And I told my wife, I said, we had an agreement when I got into coaching. I said, I'm going to go after this college thing for 3 years. And if in 3 years I can't get it done, well, then that's the Lord's way of telling me, hey, you need to head in a different direction. And I didn't see it as failure. It was just sometimes maybe you need to do something a little bit differently. So I don't think you can, if you approach something with a fear of failure, it comes back to that main theme I've given you over the last hour: confidence. Confidence is the single most important aspect in anything you're going to do when it comes to athletics. You have to have a strong belief in yourself, and you have to do it your way. Too many times I have someone call me and they'll say, hey, I want to do this just like you're doing. Can you tell me about your system? Tell me about your philosophy. And I'm always happy to share that with any coach, but I'm always quick to tell them, I do this because this is important to me. This is how I see things. This is how I want to do things. It's not because someone told me to do it this way or because I thought I could win doing it this way. It's just who I am. And I think to be successful, you have to approach it with that type of confidence. And you have to approach it, I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. And I tell our team all the time, if we're going to lose, we're going to lose playing our game. We're not going to go into game and change everything we do because we think this team is better than us. Because if we go out there and a team just beats us doing what we do, well, then we don't fail. We just learn we have to get better at what we do. So it's just me, and people may disagree with me, but I don't believe in failure. I believe you try, and if it's not successful, then you reinvent what you want to do within your own principles.
Do you tie fear in with failure? Do you tie that emotion in with the idea of failure?
I think fear is worse, much worse than failure, personally. I think if you're afraid, you're going to be timid. We tell our players all the time, it's okay to fall down. It's okay to lose. It's okay to come up short, and whether it's getting an F on a test or whether it's losing a game, and that would be the same as failing. Because sometimes the game you're trying to win is not the game right in front of you. We tell our players all the time, when you start sacrificing tomorrow to win today, then you're in the wrong program. The mantra in our program is always, every single time, you sacrifice today for a better tomorrow. If we have to fail and fall a little bit short today so we can be successful tomorrow, then that's fine. So, like I said, I see failure as a temporary thing that's a necessary step in any type of success. Whereas fear, good things can come out of failure. I don't see too many good things that come out of fear. It's like, I don't know if you've ever, when I was a kid, I can remember going to the local YMCA, and you had the low dive and you had the high dive. And I remember looking at that high dive, and I'll never forget thinking, it doesn't look that bad. It's amazing. Someone needs to explain the physics of that, or maybe it's geometry. I'm not sure which science or math it would be. But when you get on that high dive, it looks 10 times higher than what it does when you're looking at it from the ground. And I can remember the fear of that. But then I can also remember jumping off it and realizing, hey, it's not that bad. But whether it's touching the stove for the first time and realizing, hey, this thing can hurt. I was hit by a drunk driver 3 years ago. And I can remember getting in a car a little bit after that. And the fear, I'd never been afraid behind a wheel before until that happened to me. And I remember dealing with it. And to me, fear is just an awful thing. And it's something, everyone's got their own different types of fear that you have to overcome. But I don't know. I'm not a big fan of fear. I think everyone needs to try and conquer their fears, and they need to deal with whatever their fears are, because fear can consume you, whereas failure can help you grow. So I see them as completely separate entities, and I'll take failure over fear any day of the week and twice on Sundays.
How did you get back behind the car? Because it sounds like that caused fear in you that you had not realized before getting hit. And thank God that you're fine, by the way. I'm so glad that you came out fine. But you said you were afraid for a while. How did you overcome that?
Well, it's funny because it's one of those things I think you get behind. It's like you don't think you're going to be afraid, and there's times you're not, but then something happens, or maybe a car gets a little bit too close, or somebody stops just short. And these are all things that you never would have given a second thought to before. But that's what fear is. Once it happens the first time, and makes you aware, once you're in a situation like that. I was going 55 miles an hour and I got hit almost head on. And the feeling of that moment is something you never forget that. And it's impossible to forget that, because now you know what it feels like to be in a violent car crash. And whereas before, I tell my children all the time, enjoy being a kid. Ignorance, I think ignorance is bliss. I don't like reading the labels on, if I have to take a prescription drug, I don't want to read the side effects, because, then it's in my head. To me, that's what fear is. Fear is just something that once you know what it is or what it's capable of, it gets in your head. And I like to be an optimist. I like to think I'm one of the eternal optimists in this world. I'd rather believe in the good in things. I'd like to see the glasses half full. I don't want to think about what could happen. I just don't want to live life in fear. I certainly don't want to coach out of fear. I think if you approach anything out of fear, you're always going to be cautious, maybe a little bit too cautious. And if you're cautious, you're always going to be safe. You're going to be much safer than probably I am sometimes. But I just don't think, I think you're going to miss out on the great moments in life. And I'd rather deal with a little bit of fear here and there and maybe suffer some setbacks to experience those truly great moments in life.
That's beautiful. So tell us, what can we look forward to learning more about what's going on with your life? What's going on here in the future? Any announcements you would like to let us know about? Any future plans?
Coming up in the fall, I said we've got 10 of our top 11 players coming back. I'm going to be very disappointed if we're not picked in the preseason top 20 poll in the country. So we've got a couple things coming up on the horizon. We're very excited about the future of our program and where we're going. And hopefully the next big announcement you hear from us is we get to cut a net down and we win another championship here in the near future.
Hey, do you think you'll ever write a book?
It's funny. We joke about that. I think as a coach, I've got some incredible stories. I've had some amazing experiences over the year. I've been blessed to have two great assistant coaches, some phenomenal players. I think it would be fun someday to sit down and write a story about life as a coach. It would be unique. Maybe someday that'll happen. Yeah,
well, definitely not someday. Not someday. It will happen, right? With your winning mentality, I think it will happen. Well, thank you so much, Coach, for joining us today. I'm sure our listeners are going to have a lot of great insight on what happens on the court, from a human perspective and not just watching it as a spectator. There's a lot of value in what you're teaching these ladies and the students in general, and so they're very fortunate to have you. That's great. So thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And with that, thank you again for joining me, your host, Monique, and our guest, Kevin Pederson, on the Emotions Matter podcast.